Chevre, hello, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark und freilich begashmis und beruchnis. Today is Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parshas Metzora, Erev Shabbos HaGodel, and this upcoming week, Tuesday, is the Metzora Shem Ubez Shem Yisbarach Yir Aleph Nissan, when the Rebbe turns 120. We're celebrating 120 years since the Rebbe's birth. So obviously we have to learn lessons in all of these things. But first we'll start with one of the last days that we are saying the Rebbe's old capital, Kuf Chof. And the Pasuk is talking about speech, bad speech, slandering, etc. And it says, Chitzei Giber Shinunim Im Gachalei Somim, which literally translates, the deceitful tongue resembles the sharp arrows of a mighty one and the coals of broom wood. This week's Parsha is Parshas Metzora. As we mentioned last week, Sazria and Metzora are both talking about a supernatural skin condition that came as a result of Lashon Hara, Metzishemra, bad speech. And this kapitel talks about good speech and the bad effects of bad speech. In other words, how you have to train yourself. It's very hard. It's a lifelong education. And the Mefarshim explain, what does it mean like sharp arrows? Number one, it could kill, like a sharp arrow could kill. And number two, it strikes from a distance. What does it mean it could strike from a distance? That means sometimes something you say in one end of the world could travel to the other end of the world. And you don't realize the damage that is done through the speech. So that's the first lesson of today, connected to the Rebbe's kapitel, Kuf Chof, and the Parsha. And we'll talk, hopefully, at the end of the lesson, how we saw from the Rebbe a crazy level of holiness in speech and the negation of all negative speech to the extreme. Today, we're going to talk about a subject which was not usually spoken about, meaning to say, usually I try to focus on one point. Today, we're going to talk about a concept and talk about a couple of lessons, takeaways from this story. That's something we're celebrating these days in the month of the calendar of Nissan. So there's a famous talk of the Rebbe from Parshas Vayikra Tovshin Mem Zayin. It's also printed in Likutei Sichos Nissan Chelik Lamed Beis. And that is that right now we're in the days of Nissan, and we don't say Tachton the whole month. Why? Because the first part of the month, every day a Nasi, a tribal leader, brought a gift, a sacrifice, an offering to Hashem, celebrating the inauguration of the tabernacle. So it's a celebration. In honor of that, we don't say Tachna, and then Yantiv comes, so therefore most of the month we don't say Tachna, so therefore the whole month we don't say Tachna. So the Rebbe points out the extraordinariness of the fact that the tribal leaders bring an offering, and then we celebrate that, commemorate that, forever and ever and ever. Not everything that the Avos did, for example, is celebrated forever or made a commemoration of. And even though we say there's something called Zeichel and Mikdash, sometimes we do something called Zeichel and Mikdash, again, we don't have one specific thing. We daven 3 times a day that's connected to the Korbanos. But it's not that there's an event. This was a one-off offering that we don't have anything similar that we keep on doing because of that. But because of that one-off event that happened when the Mishkan was erected by the inauguration, we continue it forever and ever in the Jewish calendar, celebrating this by the beginning of Nisan. We also say a tremendous Yehi Ratzon, as we'll talk about soon, the Yehi Ratzon that we say afterwards, and that we say how what we're doing today by the fact that we recite that portion of the Torah which discusses, in Parshas Nasi, which discusses how we brought that sacrifice, will be impacted. It'll have an influence on us right now, and it changes us, it brings us an infusion of understanding, and it leads us to a greater service of Hashem. So basically, the Rebbe's question is, what makes this so special? What makes this so unique that till this very day, we make such a big deal about it? That's the point of the question. And the point that the Rebbe answers, is that there are certain things that happen that are for the ages. But what does it mean for the ages? There are those things that are very, very foundation. And things that are at their very foundation are on two levels. Number one, they continue forever. When you have a foundation of a building, you never graduate from the foundation. The foundation remains the foundation. Secondly, the power of the foundation is that if you get it right, it's always right. So that's the impact that a foundation has forever. Let's say a simple example is when you taught the rules of English, grammar, verb, noun, adjective, or diktuk in Lashon Kodesh, or math. You know the teacher that taught it to you. If you had a good teacher in 3rd grade or in 4th grade, you say, wow, that teacher set me straight. I'll always remember the rules that teacher taught me. If you didn't have a good teacher, you have it crooked, it's always not clear, and you always think to yourself, you know what, I didn't learn well by that teacher. That teacher wasn't good in implanting the foundations properly. So we see that it's at the time of the implanting, at the foundation, that causes the strength to continue forever, the power of that, but also we're constantly referring to it. Now the same thing is true, we once spoke about this probably in Hanukkah time somewhere. Anywhere we see a concept of chinuch, Chanukas HaMikdash, there was a Chanukas HaMikdash, there's going to be a Chanukas Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi. There's the day you take your child to Cheder, you wrap him in the talis, you throw candies. There's a Chanukas HaBayis Farbrengen. The only time you have to make Farbrengen in your house is to bring down that extra infusion of spiritual force and energy to remain in that house forever. And you do that by making a Farbrengen and your friends wishing you Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Each friend telling you Mazel Tov brings down a greater infusion. And that's it. It's a one-off Farbrengen. But you celebrate the fact in the sense that that one-off is super, super concentrated energy that lasts forever. So what the Rebbe answers, first of all, is that because the Chanukas HaMishkan is a foundation, that's the first time, Rosh Chodesh Nissan, that God comes down into this world like never before. In a sense, greater than Matan Torah, as we spoke before once. Now, we're making this world a home for Hashem. And that's what it's all about. And remains what it's all about forever and ever. So therefore, everything associated to the grand opening and the first time we're causing that mammoth, infinite accomplishment of bringing down, bridging the greatest gap, infinity of godliness into the world, everything associated with that is fundamental and foundational and has to be looked at and analyzed and celebrated. From that, the Rebbe comes to another lesson about a Nasi as tribal leaders, which the word Nasi is fluid. Sometimes we refer to 12 leaders of tribes and their influence on the tribe. Sometimes we refer to the one who was the Av Bezdin. And then the Rebbe takes it, of course, to what it means in our times by Chabad. There's a Nasi Hadoir, the prince, the leader of the entire generation. And the Rebbe's point is the nitzchis, the eternity of what a Nasi does and how it leaves an impact forever. And that's also connected. 12 Nisim brought a carbon, and it's Kedusha and it's holiness. And Kedusha le'zazam and kema, and holiness doesn't move. So the act that they did thousands and thousands of years ago still has power. And to what degree does it have power? Not only that it remains a foundation, we actually recite that portion of the Torah, and it's impacting me in a major way today when I say that portion, as we'll see later. And the main lesson of the Rebbe's Sikha is how we have to appreciate the nitzchis, the immortality or the eternity, the enduring permanence of whatever a Nasi does in relation to holiness. The holiness energy, the holiness power the actual power to bring results connected to a Nasi is there forever. That's the point that the Rebbe brings out. And the starting point of this concept, he brings proof positive from our Jewish custom today to say this parsha of the Nesiim and to actually verbalize the impact that it has on me. What more greater proof positive could you have than a Maisa, an action that we're actually doing this? We don't say Tach until this very day. We actually recite that portion and we discuss how it's impacting. But before we get to that, let's just talk about some other lessons that I realize now looking into the story of the Nesiim. Some lessons that I never spoke about before, takeaways that is connected to it, is number one, the Eibishter could have told Moshe, let all the Nesiim bring it in one day. Just like when you're in a shul and someone has to bench Goimel, everybody came from overseas now, Chodesh Nissan to a certain city or Tishrei, they all go up to the Torah at the same time and bench Goimel. Comes like Baimer and we make Upshai Nishan, everybody makes it at the same time. Hashem could have told Moshe, okay, the tribal leaders want to bring sacrifices, they should all bring it on the first day. What's the problem? No problem. There's enough room. The production line of the Beis HaMikdash can handle the 12 kabbanis of the Nesiim in one day. But here we see, when it's a special time, let's try to stretch it for all we got. Savor it. Don't only make it one day, make it 12 days. Amazing. And it also shows how each one's korban is precious. It has a special value. If we would only celebrate, one day as they all bring, we wouldn't see unique quality in every day. And the whole point is there's 12 tribes. 12 tribes represents every single type, every single stripe, every single diversity. And we're saying we're all valuable, you're all special. Every day another tribal leader will bring a sacrifice that represents his whole tribe. Every tribe is essential. We need everyone. Scholars, writers, electricians, plumbers, truck drivers, divers, athletes, whatever it is. We need all your unique talents. Bring it to the table and channel it towards the greater good. So that's one lesson. Another very interesting lesson is they were never commanded. The tribal leaders were never commanded to bring this sacrifice, to this gift, this offering. So this brings us to another whole discussion, which to tell you the truth, I don't have the answer 100%. There are some rare occasions where we say that if you take the initiative, it could be wrong. Why? Because there was no commandment and you didn't double check if it's the right thing to do. And because you made it up, you decided. Therefore, it could be wrong. And sometimes we say, no, we're waiting for you to take the initiative. We have to command you for everything. Where's your initiative? And over here, if I may say so, I think we have the greatest example that I never thought about before. On the very same day, and the Mefarshim pick it up, on the very same day that Nadav and Avihu were passed on because they brought an Eish Zara that was not commanded, on that very same day, the leaders of the tribes decided to bring an offering that they weren't commanded. So that's a question. Maybe just like that was wrong, this would be wrong. And therefore Moshe wasn't sure what to do. And Hashem told him to accept the sacrifice. And therefore it could be on a simple level. Here's the difference. The tribal leaders came to Moshe and probably suggested, we would like to do this. Is it okay? So they got to check. And maybe that's the answer to this whole initiative dilemma. Always double check with somebody higher than you or a good friend in spirituality to make sure you're on the right track. So the second lesson, besides for savor every day, everyone's contribution is unique, stretch a Jewish celebration as much as possible. Also, over here we see the idea of taking the initiative, grab the initiative. Come on. We expect great gifts from you. Bring it forth. That's the second lesson. Another lesson, which everyone knows, and if I'm not going to elaborate on it, is that even though the verses say how each one brought the same exact sacrifice, and the famous question is, why does it have to be repeated? And the answer to that is also a very important lesson, because each one's intention was different. First of all, as a matter of fact, it's interesting to note that none of them knew what the other one, no tribal leader knew what the other person's sacrifice was going to be, and each one came to this conclusion to bring the same material sacrifice. But the truth is that material sacrifice included in it tremendous levels and layers of secrets, things of cosmic importance, things that have to do with spiritual worlds, remuzim to the whole history of the Jewish nation. And each one's sacrifice was connected to the history of their own tribe. How is it possible that physically it came out to be the same thing, with the same exact materials, and still each one represents things that are related to that tribe in particular? That itself shows you the beauty of godliness. How in the same time there could be a commonality, but in that commonality there's still uniqueness and diversity and particulars. And the main answer of why the Torah repeats it according to most Mefarshim is because each tribal leader that brought it had different intentions, and therefore it becomes a different sacrifice. This is Reuven's sacrifice, this is Shimon's sacrifice. The intention also changes the sacrifice, and it represents their unique contribution. And that's the lesson in general when it comes to each person. You see the other person davening, or you see the other person putting on film, or you see the other person shaking the lulav. Just because he's doing the same thing, it doesn't mean it's the same thing. We want to see how Shmerel shakes a lulav. His shaking of a lulav is different than Beryl shaking the lulav. And the same thing is Yiddishkeit. Each and every person has their unique contribution in the system itself. And it's not a contradiction. Now, I want to go back to the Sikha and bring it down to Lubavitchers, Chabad Chassidim in particular. Talking about this idea how the objects of the leaders also have a holiness that's infused by their involvement. The Rebbe brings from a Hasidic discourse of the Frierdiker Rebbe, who in his first discourse, he wrote the following. I'm just going to read it quickly, the paragraph and a half that he describes it. The place of the Torah and the service of this tzaddik, this holy man. The physical place of this world, his shtender, his table, his room. It's even after he departs the physical life to the true life. And a reflection of his entire life service remains in that physical place. You could say that the place where he studied and he occupied himself with Torah, v'chol kelev, and all utensils that he used for his service of Hashem, kedushosoy aleim, the holiness of the tzaddik resides upon those physical utensils. It's part of the things that he elevated and refined in the world. And then, immediately that following, the Frierdiker Rebbe says something that he witnessed. He saw his father, but I saw once my father, Nichnas l'cheder oviv, go into the room of his father, the Rebbe Marash. And the room was arranged exactly as if my grandfather was alive. The Rebbe Marash was the Frierdiker Rebbe's grandfather. He's saying, I saw my father walk into my grandfather's room, and the room was exactly the way it was as when my grandfather was alive. The Nichnas lovish b'chagura, my father went and dressed with a gartel. Va'omad eitzel hashulchan, he stood opposite the table. Lemul kisei, shiftei, opposite the chair where my grandfather would sit. Usvasov na'ois kimedaber ubacha harbe, and his lips were moving as he was speaking, and he cried very much. So, right after he says how the utensils, the physical objects of the tzaddik also become infused and imbued with that holiness, he says the story of his father who approached the table of his grandfather after his grandfather's passing, and he was basking in the holiness connected to some sort of reflection of the presence of his grandfather's holiness and energies that were still in that room. And the Rebbe takes the lesson from this, how we have to connect ourselves to the Nasi. We all have to connect ourselves to spiritual leaders. And that's the lesson. And he also connects it to this past week was Beis Nissan. Sunday was Beis Nissan, the day of passing of the Rebbe Rashab, who said, Ich gehe in Himmel und ich sovim lo zechaich. I'm going to ascend on high, and I leave my writings to you. And the Rebbe brings up the profundity of what he's saying over here is, Ich gehe in Himmel. When you say the heavens, it means the heavens to no end. Und ich sovim lo zechaich means, but I'm still leaving my writings to you wherever you are. In other words, it's the meeting of how even wherever I am in my highest of my heights, you could connect with that wherever you are in the physical world through learning my writings. My essence is in my writings, and by studying my writings, you get my essence no matter how high I am. Now we come to Shabbos HaGodol. Should be a great Shabbos. It should be a great Shabbos in every single definition, great miracles, great salvations. I'll just finish with the story. And it tells you about the importance of speech, what a small word, what a good word the Rebbe could say and changes a person's whole perspective. There's all different sorts of stories of the Rebbe. Great stories. Great stories. You know what a great story is? When it has a great impact. So there was a rabbi, his name is Rabbi Norbert Weinberg. And this is a gem video. He says the story. He was a rabbi of a synagogue in the late 50s, and he also was a teacher. And his main problem in teaching was that even though he felt that he was teaching, giving it over all to the students, but nevertheless, in class, they seemed that they were receptive. But then once they went home and the parents were very secular and non-observant, and the parents negated whatever he taught in class. So he thought it was a fail. What's the point of me sitting and teaching if I'm never going to get anywhere because they're under the influence of the parents? Meanwhile, he says the Rebbe's name was getting to be known at that time as a force in Judaism. People consulted him. I thought I'm going to go ask him what he thinks. I went with my cousin to the Rebbe, and when I walked into the room, the Rebbe stood up. That itself, I was taken by that. Nia Noichi, who I am, I'm a young schnook. And here's the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who stands up when I walk into the room, and he shook our hands, and that gave the impression immediately how the Rebbe is truly interested in meeting us. Anyway, so I asked the Rebbe what should I do. I told him about my problem, and then the Rebbe told me like this. He said, in Jewish law, for to be in existence of somebody who is chayiv misa, a murderer who gets the death penalty, is almost non-existent. Because there's so many conditions that have to be met. He would have to have been warned by two people and then not listen to them and then still commit the murder in front of many people, etc., etc., etc. And they would ask questions in the interrogation that most people would never be able to remember exactly the details of what happened, like what color socks was he wearing, things like that. So the Rebbe told this rabbi, imagine you have a Jew, alas, he's giving a theoretical story. Imagine you have a Jew who is about to be, chayiv misa, executed because he committed murder. He's such a character that he came to such a level, he's in a quite low level. But right before he's going to be executed, he says he wants to have a drink. We should give him a drink. Now, his obligation and his desire is to make a bracha. His bracha is as important and essential as a bracha of a tzaddik gomor. So here we have a person who wants to bless Hashem. Now, if you hadn't taught him about making a bracha, he would know how to make a bracha. So the message the Rebbe was giving him is This is even talking about somebody who, God forbid, committed murder and has to go through a whole court cases and involved in grave, serious offenses. Now imagine we're talking about an innocent child with his whole life ahead of him, and he's a young, impressionable age, and you have the opportunity to teach him a bracha, i.e. to teach him other positive things about Judaism. You're not going to teach him and give him some positive light for Judaism, some positive nutrition of Judaism. Forget about what other people are going to get. Forget about what they're not doing. Think about what you're giving them that they could do and they will do in Metzora. That's what the Rebbe told him. By the way, when he started saying this, he says, I wanted to ask the Rebbe my opinion. Maybe the Rebbe would agree with me. Maybe he'd think I should become a lawyer or a doctor. Then he says, I guarantee you that's not what happened. And he tells the story. But the point is, and he says himself that he had it very hard. And he says rabbis have it hard. It's hard to be a rabbi. It's hard to be a teacher. But when you have these words of the Rebbe telling you about the unbelievable impression and impact you could have on a Jewish child, so everything else pales in comparison, and that kept me going. And this is what the Rebbe said. So these are the things we have to always keep in mind when we're thinking about the Rebbe and it's coming to the 120th birthday. The Rebbe represents striving for excellence. The Rebbe represents always spreading more light. The Rebbe represents, when it comes to speech, everyone knows he wouldn't say tumeh. He would say the opposite of tara. He wouldn't say misa. He would say hepech hachayim, etc., etc. If only we could learn somewhat of that level of being so careful in speech. So the Eibusher should help. That we should think of a gift, just like we're talking about gifts these days that were brought to the Mishkan. We should ourselves think about gifts that we should bring to the Rebbe. We have to remember, if not for Yud Aleph Nissan, if not for Yud Aleph Nissan, Kama Johnny Ikabishuka. Where would I be today without the influence of the Rebbe? So we have to give a major day of thanksgiving. In Metzora on Tuesday is a major day of thanksgiving, a major day of gratitude, and more importantly, to think of new resolutions to become reinvigorated in our activities for Yiddishkeit, for mankind, for the betterment of the world. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos. It should be an unbelievable Shabbos HaGadol, and Ki Meitzeischa Meretz Mitzrayim, Arenu Neflois, Begula Mitzvah Shlema, take it from Yad, Mamish, posting from my home, Be'ez Shem Yisborach, your man in Melbourne.